All right, go with me for a second. You've made a lounge chair and you love sitting in it, watching TV, maybe reading a book. But when you're reading your book, you need more light because you're straining your eyes. So you need to build a lamp. Actually, I need to build a lamp. So today I'm going to build this lamp out of white oak with some really cool brass details, and it's going to be great. I've been wanting to design a floor lamp for a long time now. When I first got into making furniture, lamps were some of the first things I started with. There's something really satisfying about making something that looks nice as is, but then you can also flick a switch and it looks nice in the dark too. And just to get it out of the way right here at the top,
I love lamp.
So I decided to build a lamp that's sized to accompany a lounge chair, and for me it was specifically my Glen lounge chair. It's also cool because I think this design could easily be scaled up or down to fit different spaces and applications. I also want to mention real quick, we aren't going to be offering plans for this lamp. A lot of this build was me experimenting with different materials and design ideas, and we didn't feel like it made sense to make this one into a plan. But you can go check out all our other pieces that we have in-depth plans for on our website, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Alright, I was able to get the main section of the lamp from a single board of 8/4 white oak and still have plenty to spare. So, as you can see, I needed one long section for the main arm, and I needed to do a quick glue up to get enough width for the lower vertical section. From there, I could start marking out all of my parts, and I did this all straight onto my material. Usually for something like this, I'll make some templates after verifying that I have all the measurements and proportions just right, but for something that's a single piece that I most likely won't be recreating in the future, it's fun to do a bit of the designing on the fly. It's also a piece where the specific dimensions and angles don't really matter as long as they're close. There aren't any parts that have to line up or come together anywhere, so it's pretty low stress, which is nice. Really, the only thing that matters is that this edge and this edge are parallel to each other. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, that doesn't even really matter either. So with everything marked up, I could use a combination of a few different saws, because what's the point in having them if you aren't going to use them? A bit of bandsaw to rough cut, then table saw for the joint faces, then I actually used my track saw to cut some of the edges on each part. Now, before I glued the two arm sections together, I wanted to do a couple things I figured would be easier to do with them separate. First, I wanted to attach the lower brass plate for the swivel mechanism. I'll talk more about this in a bit, but for now, I shaped the brass, then needed to cut a shallow recess so that the brass plate sat flush with the bottom edge of the lower vertical section. I also needed to cut a groove into the very top of the upper arm section to accept a brass square rod that the bulb and lampshade will hang from. So a quick router jig to be sure I was cutting the groove centered, and I was good to go. Then I could go ahead and glue the two sections together after cutting in a few dominoes. With the two sections now as one, I did a little cleanup to flush the edges as well as the joint transition, and then I could finish the brass plate and make sure it would attach to the bottom properly. At this point, the main arm was mostly finished, and I could turn my attention to making the base, which was made out of 5/4 white oak. So with a panel glued up that was wide enough, I could mark out the shape of the base, and once again, most of the dimensions and angles were arbitrary. I just did what I thought looked good. From there, I could work on the swivel mechanism, and the idea for this was to cut an arc into the base that would allow the lamp to swivel, then be locked into place anywhere along that curve. I was kind of imagining this lamp sitting between two chairs, and you could turn it depending on which chair you were sitting in. So the idea is to cut a curved slot with a recess that a bolt could sit in, then use a knob on the top side, which could be loosened and tightened as needed. Spoiler alert, it works about as good as you would expect when made by a woodworker who's impressed by the engineering of a pencil sharpener.
Ferrule? Oh, I just coughed. Dust everywhere.
But I was able to pretty easily cut the curved slot with a router and a circle cutting jig. With that finished, I could shape the rest of the base piece, then insert a screw and washer at the pivot point at the back of the lamp arm. Alright, at this point I set aside the main lamp parts and started to work on the lampshade, and I wanted to make the lampshade out of wood too. I decided to go with walnut to give the whole piece some contrast when the shade was paired with the white oak. So I started by cutting a 6-inch wide strip of thin veneer, which I could then use my drum sander to get down to around a 32nd of an inch thick. I also needed the frame that the shade would wrap around, so I modeled a simple design that I've actually used in the past on some other lamps that also has a spot for the bulb socket. and I could easily cut this out on the CNC. I gave the frame a quick coat of paint, which I forgot to film, so here's a clip of me painting one of these I made from a few years ago. Then I could glue the walnut veneer onto the outside edge of the frame. With the lampshade done, the majority of the fabrication for this piece was finished, and it was just the final details. But with something like this, those final details probably accounted for at least half of the work, so let's go ahead and dive in. I first got the brass top bar cut to length with the matching angle on one end, and then could drill and countersink holes to attach it to the lamp arm. I also needed to cut a channel into the bar that would allow the lamp wire to sit below the edge of the brass and help conceal the wire. I was able to do this on the CNC as well, and this was the first time I've cut any sort of metal on the CNC, and it went surprisingly well. And you have to machine it really slowly, so you get to enjoy this for a while. I then needed to cut a groove down the back edge of the lamp arm and lower section, again to conceal the wire. I did this on the router table and cut a stepped groove so that I could cover the wire with a strip of oak once it was in place. So with the brass bar in place and the groove cut into the lamp arm, I could work on placing the wire, and I needed to drill a small hole to run the wire from the brass into the lamp arm. Honestly, this wasn't my ideal way of doing this, and I had come up with a few other options, but in the end this was the simplest and had the lowest chance of completely screwing it up, so naturally I went with that. To complete the wiring for the lamp, I needed to place the switch, and I went with a dimmer switch and knob. So I cut a quick template that matched the brass switch plate that I had made earlier, and I used that to cut a recess on the front of the lamp arm. I then needed to drill a hole from the back of the arm to allow the wiring to be fed to the switch. I could then get all of the individual parts attached to the lamp, then run the wire from the top down to the switch, then down to the bottom of the lamp. And while I do that, let's take a second and thank Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. Both Chris and I have been using Squarespace to build and maintain our websites for years now, and honestly it's one of the best choices we made when starting our businesses. At the time, I had no idea what I needed to do to build a website, but Squarespace makes it super easy to get up and running with plenty of professional looking templates to choose from, as well as making things like purchasing domains really simple. Squarespace also has plenty of e-commerce tools to help you grow your business. Things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allow us to easily manage online transactions and not get bogged down with mundane tasks so that we can devote more time to doing the things we enjoy, like making a floor lamp. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one, go check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Head over to squarespace.com/Foureyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code Foureyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. Now let's get back to this lamp. Once all of the wiring was in place, I could cut a few strips of white oak that could be glued into place on top of the wiring. And that could be flush trimmed, and for the most part, you can barely tell anything was covered up. Except right here, you can definitely tell something was covered up here. At this point, I added one more detail to the underside of the base, then I could sand and add some finish, and I opted to roll on the finish for this one since I wanted to be careful not to get finish on any of the brass. I added a bit of felt to the underside of the lamp arm to help with the swivel action, then got everything assembled. have to say the swivel action worked okay, and by okay I mean not that great. I'm sure there would be better ways to do this, but it looks pretty cool and it is technically adjustable, so I'm good with it. And I think the lamp as a whole looks great too, but one thing I always struggle with for the furniture I make is how to categorize what it is. I was gonna call this a modern floor lamp, but is it modern? It always feels a little weird calling stuff modern. Personally, I think it looks more retro than modern, so I suppose I could always just call it mid-century modern. That's an easy one. Whatever. I guess I'll just call it floor lamp. That works for me.